see the world in a grain of sand, a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour.
I remember driving through New York City as a kid with my family, and I saw this massive billboard on the side of this building. It was an Apple ad, but all it said was, "Think different." I didn't even know what it was about, but I just remember feeling so inspired, thinking, yes, I do want to think differently. At the time, we had 2 PC desktop computers, and they were very square, tan, very boring looking. But then our grandma gave us an Apple desktop computer, and it didn't even look like a computer. It was like this weird bubble that had almost no right angles. It was blue and white, but it was see-through. And I remember looking inside and being able to see the chips and like wondering how all of it worked. But it's interesting that that technology led to the iPhone. And the iPhone definitely empowered our thinking, definitely caused us to think differently, but it primarily connected us, where we know everything everybody's thinking that we like and follow, and it made it much easier to think the exact same way they do. I'm looking at some of the pictures from this ad campaign, and one of them is awesome. It's Einstein, he's sitting, he has a pipe in his mouth, he has this crazy hair, and there's a quote of his in the corner that says, "Imagination is more important than knowledge." And I think why this campaign was so inspiring is we want to be like Einstein. Einstein is somebody who thought differently. He was an incredible spatial thinker that had a powerful imagination. He literally would do thought experiments in his head that led to him discovering how the universe works, whereas the experimenters didn't discover that because they couldn't conceive of how different it was from the way that they were thinking. But the thing is technology led us away from spatial thinking and away from using our imagination. It primarily connects us through words. We send short text messages, we tweet short tweets, and gets us thinking in these short sentences that is not at all connected to our spatial reasoning and our ability to imagine. And so it got me asking the question, is there a form of technology that actually could help us think different like Einstein did? So the brain's divided into 2 parts. You got the left brain and the right brain, otherwise known as the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. But these 2 sides of the brain actually see the world incredibly differently. So the left hemisphere sees the world as a whole bunch of building blocks. Imagine Legos. And you use the left hemisphere to do things like logic and language. So for most people, their language is exclusively in the left hemisphere, and you build your understanding of the world by piecing together concepts into these towers of how you perceive the world and what you believe is true about the world. Completely differently, the right hemisphere doesn't see the individual parts of the world at all. All it sees is the whole thing, which is hard to wrap your mind around at first because we are so heavily dominated by our verbal thinking, which does see the world as pieces. But a way to say it might be that the right hemisphere doesn't see the nouns that make up the world, it just sees the relationships between the nouns, and all those relationships are all connected into a whole. Imagine a spider's web. It's all these individual strands that are connected into a single whole. And if you grab one of the threads of a spider's web and pull on it, it deforms the rest of it. Which then leads to this this ability that your right hemisphere has to have incredible insights. Let's say you're working a logic problem and somebody who's using the right hemisphere to solve the logic problem might make an intuitive leap 25 steps down the line and they're right, and you're thinking, oh my god, that guy's a genius. How did he just bypass all these intermediary steps to get to that final result? And if you ask him, he's like, it just felt right. That's right hemisphere thinking, right? His right hemisphere was mapping the world as this unified whole, and he asked the question, oh, okay, so what does this lead to? And the other side of that spider web moved as he pulled on the thread. In this metaphor that's getting a little bit confusing, but stick with me. That's the kind of power and insight that the right hemisphere has, but our language often suppresses that kind of thinking. So I was trying to think of a good example to illustrate this, and the one I came up with is catching a baseball. When you're first learning how to catch a baseball, your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere are both involved. Your left hemisphere is thinking of the steps, like how I hold my mitt, where I move it, that kind of thing. Your right hemisphere is processing the spatial information, where's the baseball, how fast is it moving. But as you get good at it, it pretty much all moves to your right hemisphere, and you don't even feel like you're trying to think about how to catch a baseball. You just have a sense of what to do, and it's almost like your hand is drawn to where the baseball is going to be. It's kind of like if your hand was the other side of a lightning bolt. You know how lightning comes down from the cloud but also comes up from the ground, and they're both zigzagging through the air, but somehow they always meet each other? From the outside looking at it, you might think like, how's that possible that these zigzagging paths somehow always intersect? But from the lightning bolt's perspective, I guess you could say, of course they always meet each other, because there's a negative charge in the cloud and a positive charge in the ground that are actually pulling the lightning bolts together. In the same way, your right hemisphere doesn't see the world as individual parts. It doesn't see the pieces. It just sees the relationships between the pieces, and those relationships equal a unified whole. So as the baseball is moving, it's literally pulling on your hand to meet that baseball in flight. Just think about all the things that are going on there. If you were going to use your language processing to try to calculate what's going on, you'd have to try to make an assumption on how heavy the ball is. And then as each frame rate is passing, the ball's getting bigger, and then use that calculation to try to figure out what the velocity of the ball is. And then, you know, how much is gravity pulling down on this ball, and therefore where's it going to be when it gets close to me? Even if you were a super genius, you would only be halfway through that calculation when you got hit with the ball. So there's some activities that are so complicated with so many variables, our left hemisphere doesn't even try to solve them and lets the right hemisphere take them completely. But then with tasks where our left hemisphere is actually useful and can reason through and solve problems, we end up suppressing our right hemisphere too much and lose a lot of the insights we would otherwise have. That we suppress our right hemisphere holistic type thinking is that for the right hemisphere, seeing the world clearly is the same as understanding how the world works and understanding your relationship to that world. Whereas the left hemisphere, we can see the world clearly and it looks like a whole bunch of individual pieces and we don't know how to fit them together properly, and we don't know what our relationship to them is. And it can leave us feeling lost in this world that feels broken. But it's not actually the world, it's just your perception of the world. This intuition that there's a wiser, more insightful version of themselves, but for some reason they're just in the other room and it's hard to access them when you need it. There's this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson that says, In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. I don't think it's wishful thinking. There is a more insightful, wiser version of you, but it's suppressed. The purpose of these puzzles is to build a bridge between our language-dominated modern way of thinking and our deeper intuitions that sees the way the world works. If you like solving puzzles, definitely buy this. It's a fun challenge, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is to spend the time solving it, contemplating the metaphor in a way that applies it to your life. So eternity in an hour. How does this brain teaser relate to everything I've been talking about? I got this idea for this brain teaser from the William Blake poem, Auguries of Innocence, and primarily the first couple lines. The rest of the poem's okay, but the first couple lines are just awesome, and that's what you hear quoted in the Westworld TV show at the beginning. But so the first two lines, to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. It's like this idea of like, remember when you were a kid and you were looking at things for the first time and you just had this sense of wonder and amazement of what they were, right? I remember as a kid, I would look at a leaf and just look at the veins spreading out on the leaf and thinking, wow, this is so complex. And I would just sit there and be like so blown away about it. And then I would think, this is so complicated, but yet there's like millions of them all around me. Then there's even more than that on Earth. As an adult, actually, I have a similar thought today about people, because people are so complicated, and it's like every person's a universe unto themselves of all these complicated things happening, but yet there's like billions of us on this planet. And like, it's kind of crazy if you think about it. You get like, wow, there's so much going on in life. But so this feeling of awe and wonder is something that we often lose as we become adults and start working. The reason that is because we start seeing everything for its functional value. So your car gets you to work, your car gets you to the grocery store, the door gets you to the next room, the food gives you the nutrition you need to go to work and to get work done. And we get on this conveyor belt of life where we're constantly thinking about the future and what we're trying to achieve. And everything around us, we don't even see it. All we see is the functional aspects of everything around us. And we don't actually stop and look and see what the thing actually is. If we do, there's actually a profound amount of wonder and amazement there. But it's really hard to do as an adult once you've been working for too long, because you're so locked into this mindset of seeing everything for its functional value and how is it useful or not useful for your goals that you're trying to achieve, right? You're so goal oriented, it's hard to like step out of that and look around and see the world for what it actually is. the interesting thing is, when we are so goal-oriented and we see everything around us just for its functional value, we start having this sense, this anxiety that we're running out of time, that we don't have enough time to accomplish all the things that we want to accomplish. And so the idea of stopping and sitting and just enjoying the wonder of something feels like, oh, it's going to make me even more anxious because I'm wasting time when I could be getting something done. But it actually does the opposite. When you sit there and you're not trying to get something done, you step out of the anxiety of your goal-driven pursuit and you feel the wonder and excitement of things. The next two lines kind of capture that. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. There's a sense of like a richness in the moment. You go from feeling like you're running out of time to feeling like you're living in eternity, and there's endless wonder to be experienced. Because the world is actually an incredibly magical place if you can see it. It's easy to forget for two reasons: being goal-oriented and seeing everything just in a functional light, and then also the fact that there's quite a bit of suffering in the world that kind of makes us feel like it can't also be magical, but it is. I've been going through Robert Greene's Daily Laws. Today's March 8th, and I just thought it was cool that today's law actually lines up with what I'm talking about. It says, retain your sense of wonder. Youth is happy because it has the capacity to see beauty. Anyone who keeps the ability to see beauty never grows old. Franz Kafka. After we pass through a rigorous apprenticeship and begin to flex our creative muscles, we can't help but feel satisfaction in what we have learned and how far we have progressed. We naturally take for granted certain ideas we have learned and developed. Slowly, we stop asking the same kinds of questions that plagued us early on. We already know the answers. We feel ever so superior. Unknown to ourselves, the mind slowly narrows and tightens as complacency creeps into the soul. And although we may have achieved public acclaim for our past work, we stifle our own creativity and never get it back. Fight this downhill tendency as much as you can by upholding the value of active wonder. Constantly remind yourself of how little you truly know and of how mysterious the world remains. Daily Law. Reality is infinitely mysterious. Let it continually fill you with awe. Remind yourself of how much more you still can learn. So that's the idea that this brain teaser represents. But the thing is, even though you know you want something, you can tell yourself to do something and yet have no ability to follow through with it. And that's because our verbal intelligence has very little power over our behaviors and our emotions. A good way to think of emotions is as a summary of vast amounts of information that your brain has integrated. And using words to try to move emotions and change emotions is like grabbing a stone chisel and trying to move a mountain. It just doesn't work. Words can be somewhat helpful in that they can be a jumping off point to deeper forms of emotional reasoning that actually can change how you feel about something. But for the most part, they're just a jumping off point or a reference point to see where you're at and you need to rely on your deeper forms of emotional reasoning to be able to have any progress in changing how you feel about something or a behavior you're struggling with. And with the right hemisphere, I've been talking about how it processes all of your spatial reasoning, but it also processes your perception of music and poetry. So when you have these non-verbal thoughts that are these feelings or impressions, and you're trying to put them into words, but you know they mean something, those are this deeper form of intelligence, and that's the form of intelligence you need access to in order to change your behavior. But a lot of times words just get in the way and have no ability to help you. But how do you connect your verbal thinking to this deeper form of intelligence that has the power to help you change your life? And you probably know where I'm going with this, but that's the purpose of this puzzle I'm making. So using the metaphor, that's a verbal way of thinking, and that's a left hemisphere process. And then using the wire and the shapes that it makes, that's something that the right hemisphere does pretty much exclusively. So kind of forcing this connection between these two things. So when you're trying to solve this brain teaser, it's not about solving it really. It's about spending the time solving it, contemplating this idea, and asking the question. What you're doing implicitly is you're telling your brain that the answer to this question is related to the geometry of this puzzle, which causes your right hemisphere to get involved in the problem solving of the question. So how this works is the time you put in, so if it takes you a while to solve the brain teaser, that's actually a good thing. You spend time contemplating this question: how do I experience this sense of awe and wonder that I did as a kid, where I wasn't concerned about time, schedules, and the functionality of everything around me, but I just was amazed at the world in which I lived. How do I get back to that? Contemplate that while you're solving the puzzle. What you're doing is the more time you spend in this contemplation as you're trying to solve this puzzle, you're planting a seed into your subconscious. It normally takes a couple of days and a decent amount of time planting this seed, but what will happen is this idea will grow in your subconscious, and then at a certain point, a couple days later, maybe a week later, it will come to the surface. This often happens when you're relaxed, but your left hemisphere is occupied with a procedural task. So when you're doing the dishes, or you're driving a car, or you're taking a shower, what's happening is you have a list of steps that you have to do, but there's something that you've done so many times, you don't have to think about it at all. And so you start daydreaming, and that's when these ideas bubble up to the surface. Or to stick with my previous metaphor, the seed growing beneath the surface breaks through into the open air of your awareness. So poetic. This is something that happens all the time with creative people. They spend a lot of time digesting an idea, and then they wait for that inspiration to bubble back up. This is exactly what happened with me in the creation of this business. I spent years digesting a lot of these ideas I'm talking about that felt unrelated at the time, But then there was a moment where I had an idea that, what if I connected brain teasers to metaphors? And then it was this feeling of coming together of a whole bunch of unrelated ideas that all of a sudden snapped into place. And yet even then, I still didn't have the words to express the significance that I felt was behind this idea. I just felt there was a lot of substance there. And so I followed the intuition. And it wasn't until I started talking about it a lot that I realized what the true value of this idea is. So I guess a way you could think about these puzzles is as a more efficient way to digest ideas into your subconscious. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Steve Jobs. So, in the spirit of the Apple ad, but different enough to not be copyright infringement, I would encourage you guys to see the world in a new light, to practice building a bridge to your spatial intelligence that already sees the world differently, and to cultivate your own creative potential to change your life. I'm going to continue putting all my effort into making these. If you guys believe in what I'm doing, definitely like, subscribe, all that stuff. The link to my Shopify store where you can buy these is in my bio, along with all my other socials. I also have a Patreon, and if you subscribe, you'll get 2 new brain teasers a month with free shipping.